Great. Well, great to see you all here. I'm probably most of you know I'm John Hunter. I'm president of Community Rights in Douglas County, and we work to protect and defend the rights of people and nature from the harm caused by the corporate government partnership. Last month, we joined with Southern Oregon Progressive Podcast, Betsy, who's here, for a presentation about the commons, and Diana here was part of it. We talked about wilderness, the parks, and the importance of the commons for the unhoused. So today we're kind of following up more on the commons. We're going to have a discussion about water, which is supposed to belong to the people. But I think we'll find out today that that's not always the case. So our guest today is Christopher Hall. He's a great friend of Community Rights, and he's the executive director of Water League, which is out of Southern Oregon. And he will be discussing a recent issue in the Harney Basin that will likely occur across the state in coming years, where community rights are turned on their heads by large-scale industrial irrigators. So, Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out today. I really appreciate this opportunity to share this information. The community rights, place-based planning, and state preemption, these are three different systems of politics, essentially. I know you're familiar with all of them. I'm going to be getting into a discussion about how they interrelate and how they're being used and how they're being manipulated. I think it's really quite interesting because this discussion is on how a community has fought the state for the right to imperil its groundwater. And, usually we think of threats coming from outside to our community, and then we want to write some laws. And the state, of course, preempts us from doing that, but we want to write some laws to protect ourselves. But what happens when the threat comes from within? And there are codependent aligned actors, for instance, an irrigation industry that, has some businesses in town that are like connected to them in a very codependent way. What are they going to do? And so all of a sudden there's this cognitive dissonance from the inversion of this industry, which is, as you know, water rights and the industry of the irrigation industry and big ag. They are some of the most powerful, influential lobbyists in the state of Oregon, and of course, across the whole West. And so the issue that we're going to look at today is what happens when this massive political power has these centers in different communities all across the state. And the threat comes from within. It's quite fascinating. And it's something that I've started to study, and we're going to have a look at that today. All views and opinions expressed are expressly Water Leagues only. And so I want to make that clear. Water League, we are a nonprofit organization based in Oregon, 501c3, and we engage the public in water stewardship. A little bit about that. A lot of times you think of nonprofit organizations and they've got friends and members and families and all these other people who support the mission, and they're almost like an army from behind. And folks like me get up there and we say, we want this or we think that or whatever. And I've got all these people who are going to write like form letters, and they're all going to be the same letter. Our vision is that when we engage the public, they're out in front of us, they're not behind us, and that they are inspired to be able to take action, and that we aren't necessarily leading them by the nose. In fact, we're inspiring them with information and with knowledge and with up-to-date facts and a number of other ways to relate and meet with them, so that what they'll do is go out and be the water they want to be, essentially. So swim ahead, essentially. And so that's what we really are interested in. That's our brand of community engagement. I always like to start with this lovely picture of Little Grayback Creek, and that's in the Illinois Valley. This is a September picture with lovely base flows coming in from groundwater. There would be no water in this creek if the groundwater was dropped below the stream range, below the bed of the stream. And in fact, in the Harney Basin, which is our case study today, we're going to look at what's happening to groundwater dependent ecosystems, springs and streams, and a number of other entities that get harmed when groundwater is overpumped. Water League acknowledges and honors all the indigenous peoples who made their home since time immemorial throughout the areas where Water League works and upon whose ancestral homes we live. Water League acknowledges the care by which indigenous inhabitants have stewarded precious natural resources for millennia and seeks to be of service within this historical framework. Today, we will discuss how community rights, place-based planning, and state preemption interrelate and function for better and worse. The Harney Basin will be our case study. In the Harney Basin, and so Harney Basin is one of the largest basins in the state. It's part of the larger Malheur Lake Basin. It is east of the Cascades. You may have heard of the cities Burns and Hines, and that region is a high desert, about 4,000 or more feet above elevation in the lowlands. And then there are some gorgeous mountains to the north and to the south. The Harney Basin may be one of the most beautiful regions in the country. It's just extraordinary. And out there is an enormous amount of acreage that is irrigated from water being drawn from below 100 feet. You know, there's also some shallow wells, but a lot of the water that's being pumped is ancient water that was put there by the glaciers between 5,000 and 35,000 years ago. And when that's pumped out, it does not recover on human timescales. In the Harney Basin, community rights have been turned on its head by a local industry. From within the community, large-scale industrial pumpers causing excessive declines in groundwater want the state to leave them alone. They want to be able to pump. We submit that community rights activists should stand with posterity, which is a fancy word for future generations, and the ecosystem, not against it. And we will discuss how this subversion of community rights is bracketed on one side with place-based planning and on the other with state preemption. So first, we'll touch on place-based planning, which is a state-funded, locally led collaborative process that develops what are called state-recognized plans, place-based plans. So the state has a law and it allocates a very small amount of money, but a sufficient amount for specific basins. There's just a few at the moment, and they're looking to expand it right now for a few more. And what that means is the community within this basin gets a little funding to come together in rooms like this and spend some time building a plan that incorporates a lot of the aspirations of that community as to how they would like to interact with water. But when you think about it, place-based planning is a process that develops a place-based plan, and it does sound circular. And in fact, actually, what I've seen is that just building the plan itself can almost be the thing in itself, you know, as opposed to the contents in the plan, right? Folks who put their plans together would be very probably upset to hear that, but the planning process itself almost seems like that's the thing in the pie. Recently, so here it is, recently, after 10 years of developing a place-based plan, the Water Resources Commission back in September acknowledged or recognized the Harney Basin's place-based plan. 10 years of planning went into making the place-based plan eligible for recognition. That is a lot of work. And I think they did a good job, frankly. But that's a lot of work. State recognition is an official signal that agencies may use place-based plans advice for coordinating the state agency programs and funding projects. So, for instance, how do we know what we want to do in a particular basin? Well, we can go to their place-based plan and we can look at that as advice. There is no, power that they have, but that shows you kind of what they're interested in and what they would like to do. And that's not just state agencies. It's also cities and counties and nonprofit organizations that get funding. They can go to this plan and they can look at it and they can say, oh, well, let's go on the menu here and let's talk about these things. However, there's a really important caveat. Place-based planning is not in any way, shape, or form a delegation of state authority to the community. Water use governance, as in legislation and administrative rulemaking, and the management by agencies remains solely within the state branches of government. So you have to ask yourself, well, then really, what can they do? And again, it's advisory. Place-based planning is a community engagement process carried out by a locally organized collaborative that produces a plan filled with voluntary actions and a portfolio of proposed water projects that are intended to help meet current and future in-stream needs and the consumptive water uses of a place. This is kind of what this is about. And the Rogue Basin is looking to start place-based planning. They've begun that process, but there isn't one yet in the Rogue Basin.
So when you say Rogue Basin, who actually leads this community group, organizing?
That's a very good question. So the state funds it, and the state okays it, and the state recognizes it eventually after it's been developed. But there are local community members who come together and volunteer to put this together. And there can be a nonprofit organization that pays somebody to spearhead this, as they have done in other basins. And so the community effectively is working among themselves, but the state is there at all times, facilitating, funding. So it's as if the kids are allowed to play in the living room, and the parents are in the kitchen cooking dinner and making sure everything's okay, and they're making sure everything's following just right, and nobody is getting into a scuffle, and there aren't any fights, and they're not fighting over the remote or any of that sort of stuff. There's definitely a paternal aspect between the state's relationship with the community in this regard.
How does it facilitate though? I mean, people don't just say one day, I'm going to go make a water plan. How does that come about? So I'm going to give you an analogy. The criminal justice system has a local public safety coordinating council that deals with recidivism. That comes from the state, mandate money, all the things you said, but it's delegated to the county to organize this structure.
So there could be, in some cases, there could be a local watershed council. There could be a nonprofit organization, a soil water conservation district, one of those organizations that provides, that may be the recipient of the funding that then allows, rentals of rooms like this and that sort of thing.
I'm more interested in the initiator. So it could be one of those that initiates the area.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about partnership with the Imperil rivers?
No, I don't.
Okay, I'll talk to you about it later. Maybe I'm the secretary. Well, let's see. I'm no longer secretary and treasurer, but I think this would be one hell of a project for us.
Excellent.
Yeah, and maybe I can see if we can get you there to talk.
Fabulous.
Every month and stuff.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Well, we're gonna learn a little bit more about this. Okay. Place-based planning is mostly limited to a few things: convening meetings and facilitating dialogue, commission studies or data collection, of course, if you have the funding, use of the state recognized plan to attract funding partners. So the folks who are the place-based planning group, they don't actually themselves, the group isn't its own organization, so it can't get funding, but it can say, hey, look at this plan we have. Would you like to come and put a dam here? Encourage local entities to fund projects and programs, and also to organize public comments and testimony and citing that plan. So the plan says, oh, we believe in this, we want that. Now let's use this plan to help inform testimony, public comments, op-ed letters, and that kind of thing. We discussed place-based planning to highlight how large-scale industrial irrigators have recently sought to misrepresent the advisory activity as if it were a collaborative process with the state co-managing water use, which it is not. So they actually would like to turn this thing into something that it's not. Community members could collaborate with themselves, but that is not the same as collaborating with the state. The state does not co-manage. The state has preemptive authority, and this is what we're going to get into a little bit later. As if in hindsight, those who are over pumping groundwater have recently misrepresented that place-based planning afforded them power to demand collaboration with the state and equal power to shape water management, which is just unheard of, in order to set the stage for yet another advisory activity. This gets a little complicated here, with regard to administrative rulemaking, which are rules advisory committees. So when the state wants to revise rules, typically an agency will oftentimes put together a rules advisory committee. I bold advisory. Then what happens in a room like this, state agency folks and public discuss what the rules might be. And then eventually the agency just goes ahead and does what it wants because it has preemptive authority. And imagine now if there was a place-based planning activity going on over here that we were part of for 10 years, and now the state is putting in a rules advisory committee, and you go and you get on that committee, and then you say, hey, we were collaborating over here and we were like holding hands, and now it's not like that. And you have to you promised us that we could collaborate in this committee, when in fact, it's just not true. And so there's an interesting, again, it's not so much of an inversion, but it's a manipulation of dragging in this one process into this process. And so I think it's important to understand how place-based planning has been used, manipulated, and incorporated for political purposes, essentially. While it was safe to hold hands in place-based planning over here and use the term collaboration aspirationally, as in between community members, the large-scale irrigators in the Harney Basin sought to import their misuse of the term collaboration into the formal RAC process the state uses to seek public advice when writing rules to designate a critical groundwater area to reduce water use. And just so you know, the state has some statutes. They're called the Critical Groundwater Area Statutes. And if you think, what is a critical groundwater area? It's an area where groundwater is in critical decline. Groundwater levels are excessively declining, and they're declining so fast that groundwater-dependent ecosystems are desiccating, springs and streams are drying up, and future generations are looking at this, even though they're not here, going, what? So the state has statutes. And in order to enact those statutes, they actually have to start an administrative rule process, which is what they've been doing for the last 3 years, and go through that rule process to designate a critical groundwater area. And once you've done that, you can do things like impose water use curtailments. And it doesn't take your water right, it just turns the volume down on it or sets it aside for a little while. You still get to own it, it's just not getting used. We will discuss in greater detail later on in this discussion on how large-scale and industrial irrigators misappropriated the community rights ideology, as seen here in this case, to assert local control to maintain the status quo over pumping groundwater that near permanent damage by externalizing harms and other costs onto their very own community. So the use of local control to maintain overpumping, and then saying, but this is from our community. This is like what we want, it's fascinating. Now, but back to our discussion of what place-based planning is. I took a little aside there. I'm just going to reiterate some more facts about it, just so we all have a good understanding. It's a state activity that monitors the community about what they are thinking, saying, feeling about water. And that's actually a good thing. Remember, I mentioned it's like this paternal thing where the parents are looking in at the kids at the slumber party, making sure everything's okay. It's that sort of thing. And it's actually you could look at it as them wanting to assess and do focus group and learn about what the community really thinks, so that when they come in later to do regulations, they've set them up to, be successful. But there is a bit of monitoring that does go on. Public place-based planning is more of a mechanism for managing stakeholders and less about managing water. It is a state-funded public relations process that invites local people to talk about opportunities and challenges related to water. And place-based planning produces consensus reports. Consensus is not necessarily as beautiful as we think it is, because we all consented to like pump oil, and look where that got us, right? And there has been a century of consent to like just overpump groundwater sources and streams, and to look where that got us. But it produces, place-based planning produces consensus reports and project wish lists. Like, again, let's put in a dam, or let's put in a water treatment plant, that state agencies may consider in their overall water management duties. And place-based planning may have the effect of softening the blow of regulation by deepening community relationships and building some shared understanding on water supply, demand, and data. And you're like, how does that soften the blow of regulation? The theory is that the more a community comes together over ecosystem health, human supply and demand needs, the more likely they will understand why the state is going to come in and make some hard choices regarding regulation. That's like basically the hope. And again, this is not what you read when you are reading about place-based planning in a brochure. This is like what you learn when you're working within the system. Place-based planning engages various water interests in the basins and begins to inure them to water use restrictions and regulatory actions that could come down in a 10 to 20 year period. So we took 10 years, we put together a place-based plan, and boy, we ground you down, we wore you down, we inured you to this coming thing. And to deny that that's not a factor is just denial. In the 21st century, these restrictions and regulations actually protect water resources. So when we're talking about state preemption, again, not all state preemption is bad. In fact, a lot of it is aspirationally good. The worst aspects of it, which we're about to get into, is when somebody's using the state as a hammer to hit us. And this is actually inverted. You know, in the 21st century, the Water Resources Department is now acknowledging we have over-appropriated water in every basin, and we now have to protect the water for the present and the future and the ecosystems. So a side note, the state has acknowledged, so here it is, that every basin in the state has been over-appropriated. I get ahead of myself. State preemption authority, while still substantially under industrial agricultural regulatory capture, as in the big industries still practice regulatory capture. In fact, they're doubling down right now as that power is slipping away from them. It has meaningfully shifted to preventing further harm by overpumping. So that's a good thing. State laws and state agencies are working to correct the damage of the last century, which is really quite lovely. We're getting near the end of the place-based planning thing. Place-based planning is a generally well-intentioned effort to empower basin communities to gather around discussions about water supplies, in-stream needs, and their consumptive uses to address concerns and set priorities, so that when the state takes regulatory action, there has been some understanding about how to best go about it. And it's kind of a concluding statement there. Key points, it's advisory. The state controls the extent of its functions like parents do. The planning has no administrative or legislative authority and facilitates communities' aspirations so the state can take their perspective into consideration when it governs and manages water use and water quality. Now we're going to move on to state preemption authority. This is the thing that a lot of folks in the community rights world are struggling with on a 24/7 basis, where I live in a community and we are not empowered to be able to pass laws within our city or county or case laws or whatever comes out of courts that would support us to be able to have our own sovereign control, because there's all sorts of fracking, there's all sorts of clear cuts, there's any number of destructive forces that impact a local community, and then they go and they export all that money and all those goods somewhere else, and the community is left with externalized costs, and it's completely unfair. But state preemption, just for anybody who doesn't know what it is, the state of Oregon is the source of all local government power. I mean, we don't have to like that, but it is. Cities and counties may act under home rule charters and statutes. Special districts, such as water conservation districts or fire districts, may act only by statute. So when the state writes a statute to define them, and the legislature can narrow and it can override and it can withdraw these delegations whenever it chooses. It can dole out power and reel it back in however often it wants. And the state is the supreme authority. When such a powerful magic wand exists that gives a person wielding it such massive political power, those with the most economic power will take that wand and they will use it for their own benefit. So here's the state of Oregon. There's 4 million people. It has a pretty big GDP. There is a lot of power here, political and economic power. And then we have this like state government that kind of manages a lot of it. And it's like a magic wand. Wouldn't you like to control that, right? Corporations view the state government's preemption authority as a magic wand that allows them to control communities. The magic wand, but in this case, it's a political hammer, too often hits communities. And so do we blame the wand or we blame the person wielding the wand as a hammer, right? A lot of times people are like, oh, I can't stand the government, because of whatever it's doing to me, right? Well, actually, the government belongs to you. It belongs to me. It's our government. However, somebody jumped ahead of the line and took control of it and is now using it as a hammer against us. And that's the basic complaint a lot of community rights folks have, is having around such a powerful wand too dangerous because the most economically powerful will always get a hold of it and hit us with it. It's an ongoing question. While we noted earlier that regulatory capture by big ag industrial irrigation industry is struggling to control state governance and management related to water use and water quality, this means that their efforts are intensified and recalibrated. And as I mentioned, they're doubling down a little bit. So for the last 100 years, it's been smooth sailing. We just have complete access and control. And now that we have destroyed whole basins and watersheds and groundwater and surface water in the 21st century, the state agencies are going, oh, yeah, maybe not. We're going to not listen to you guys anymore so much because we hear you, but we are not going to take your advice as much as we used to. It is not going to be a straight shot anymore. And so there is a lot of panic and there's a lot of doubling down. It has occurred to them instead now to adopt community rights mantle. And I won't even necessarily say that they have consciously done this, but that's what I am seeing. It's oh, well, if we can't go and twist the arms of the folks in Salem, then let's just within these communities proclaim community rights to pump the groundwater reservoirs down to rock bottom or something.
That's been going on for decades. And here is a prime example. The first time I heard community rights mentioned in Douglas County was from the rise in the timber industry.
Very interesting.
So
thank you. Thank you very much. Well, there's no irony here since corporations essentially farm the human livestock for wealth. They use the people's government as their human resources department to manage this on their behalf. They view communities as their human resources and they want to limit resistance. And so here's the corporate industry. Here's the government. It's oh, that'll be our HR department to manage all of the consumers and the workers and laborers and everybody else. And that's and that is, of course, you all know that, but I thought I would mention corporate state preemption. There's there's two kinds of preemption, the not so bad preemption and the no good preemption. Corporate state preemption is the bad kind, is the primary variation of state authority. And it's a modern form of colonization whereby corporations practice regulatory capture to control the people's government for their own aggrandizement. Okay, so that's the corporate state preemption. The other variation of state preemption authority seeks to impress equitable standards widely so that everyone statewide experiences fair and dignified treatment under the law. So we think of ensuring equal application of education so that you go to school here, you go to school here, we're all using the same textbooks. Traffic laws are equally applied across the state. Water laws, land use, especially with the Department of Land Conservation Development, the 19 planning goals that are supposed to require political subdivisions like cities and counties to have comprehensive plans and coordinate with the state's 19 planning goals under land use, housing, law enforcement, and so forth. And all of this is to ensure equitable fairness and treatment across society. And the little asterisk there says that this is not to say, however, that it's necessarily been working sufficiently or as planned, but that's the aspirational goal. Community rights activists reject the legitimacy of state preemption when it is used to block local communities from protecting their health, safety, welfare, and ecosystem. So I haven't really met folks within the community rights community who are against the state's authority when it's actually beneficial and benevolent. It's really when it's not working. And because we have to pick our battles and we can't go after everything, it's like, let's just focus on when they're hitting us, right? In the hands of avaricious actors, state preemption becomes a hammer that hits communities by preventing them from enacting stronger protections than the state's weak regulatory standards. So again, somebody wants to come in and dump a bunch of what are arsenic in the river. Well, no. And so the people in the community who are going to be impacted by that say no. And the state's like, yeah, I'm sorry, but we're going to do this anyway. This is good for you. This may hurt you. This will hurt us more than it'll hurt you, sort of thing, right? Community rights advocates observe that all political authority originates in the people of a community, not in the state or a federal government, which is really just a tool of the people. And you here may look at this and go, yeah, this is Community Rights 101, but there will be people who are joining us who won't really fully understand this really fundamental concept that political authority originates in the people. I mean, this is the most fundamental political philosophy upon which the United States was built. And everyone learned this in grade school, really. Local governments, however, are also tools, and communities have an inherent right and a duty to use them to enact stronger protections than state or federal laws allow when the state becomes a hammer in the hands of bad actors. Again, if the state is handing out lollipops and everything is great, well, great. We don't really need to address that. That's good preemption authority. Community rights advocates assail state preemption laws that prevent localities from adopting stricter environmental or social protections when powerful actors descend upon their communities. But what happens when an industry from within a community wants substantially looser protections in the same way external corporations do? And that's where we're getting into the meat of this conversation now, which is here's our little community, and well, inside the community is the big industry, and it happens to be, in this case, an irrigation industry, and it's massive, and it's using up enormous amounts of water. In the Harney Basin, they use 96% of all the groundwater in the basin to irrigate alfalfa, most of which, 80% of which gets exported out of the basin. And again, I'll mention, there's a term called virtual water exports, which is you pump the basin, you pump the groundwater that's not recoverable in human timescales. The USGS calls it ancient groundwater, and you bring it to the surface. Now this water is connected to the atmosphere because it evapotranspires through alfalfa, and it ends up hitting the jet stream, and off it goes. And studies show that it lands somewhere in the Midwest or on the East Coast. And, we hear the water cycle from when we were in kindergarten, and, here comes the water off the ocean, and it's going to rain during the winter, and it recharges, right? Well, what happens when climate change is not actually bringing the water back? And even if there was no climate change, what happens when you're pumping it hammer and tong so fast that even a normal, naturally a variable climate couldn't keep up with it, right? That's what we're talking about. In the Harney Basin, there is a tragedy of the commons unfolding, where large-scale industrial irrigators divert 96% of groundwater in the basin, resulting in excessively declining groundwater levels. And I've done the calculations, this is not a complicated calculation. Every 5 to 9 gallons that they pump out of the ground unlocks 1 cent. So the irrigators are mining water just like gold. And if you go to a gold miner and say, hey, could you stop? I know you're only like halfway through what you think this mine will produce, but will you stop? And the miner's going to be like, what? No, there's gold in them Dar Hills, and I'm not stopping until I exhaust this mine. And that's the difference between water use and water mining. It's when you intend to get all the value out of it. And when we think of like oil riggers and oil drillers, they go from one oil well to the next, and they exhaust that oil well, and then they go to the next one, and they see all these old derelict oil rigs, right? They exhaust oil fields. Well, they're doing that with water. And it would, we don't need water for life. We don't need oil for life. We need water for life. Water is life. And so to treat water like you do gold and oil is just wrong. And of course, you're probably familiar with the tragedy of the Commons. Garrett Hardin, 57 years ago in 1968, he said, hey, when these grazers, cow, sheep, whatever, overgraze the commons, then they destroy the resource, and then all the animals have to die and go away because you destroyed it. And so here's one grazer, Billy. Billy's thinking, well, this is wrong morally. I'm going to take my cows off it because we're overgrazing it. And then Billy's thinking to himself, but wait, no one else is going to stop. So why should I stop if no one else is going to stop? Let's just get what we can out of this, right? And then I'll slaughter my cows later. And the same thing is happening with this groundwater, that when you're mining water and you're essentially pumping water like a water bank, and a water bank is the term that's used, out of the ground, I mean, there is no incentive to stop. You're prevented from your own desires to get money. It's like, oh, there's money in this bank account, but don't bother taking any more of it. In this society, that just doesn't work. And so the tragedy of the commons is this inescapable fact, and that's what we're experiencing. They are powerless to stop themselves and have only partially relented recently, when state preemptive authority to impose water use curtailments became inescapable. So the state's coming down and saying, we're going to have to curtail your water rights. And so this is the only time where they've actually said, well, okay, hold on. Well, let's talk, right? Water pumping earns an estimated $45 million for this small cohort in the basin. They will use, this 2 degrees of separation, 3 degrees of separation, and all this fuel and all these other things that are expended in relation to this $45 million of, income that comes from pumping the water and selling the alfalfa. But really, those things, all those second and third tertiary expenses are already counted in our economy. So, when we do, can you imagine if everybody did that? We would quadruple and quintuple the size of our economy if every time we talked about how much money is this economic factor, we were to bring all these other things into it. So it's that diesel fuel is already being counted by somebody else. So, but in any case, imagine if the corporate interests came from within the community and wanted all the water possible. That's what's going on. There's $45 million every year, and we're going to get it. And it's your neighbor, essentially. For 35 years in the high desert in the Harney Basin, recharge and discharge have been out of balance. So recharge comes in the winter and it rains, and discharge goes out in the summer. And typically without irrigation, discharge is coming out of groundwater in springs and streams. And then there are groundwater dependent ecosystems like trees and brush and all sorts of flora and fauna that require water. And they will do natural evapotranspiration into the sky. That is discharge. But what happened is that it got thrown out of balance around 1990 or so, when irrigation started to double from its existing rates. And today, groundwater levels are excessively declining. They are dropping. And each year, there is a 110,000 acre foot of water that evapotranspires off the alfalfa and goes missing. And it goes missing as a virtual water export. And where are they selling this alfalfa? Well, a bunch of it's sold outside the basin within Oregon, and a bunch is sold outside of Oregon to other states. But then also there's a big portion of it that is ending up in Japan and China, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and that's where the big money is for your alfalfa. So are you going to sell your alfalfa locally? You know, I mean, 80% leaves the basin. If you can make more of it by selling it to like Mr. Bonesaw or whatever it is, you know, it's like, because they have expensive horses in Saudi Arabia. And so this deficit, mind you, of recharge and discharge that's been going on now every year, 110,000 acre feet, is the equivalent amount of water that the city of Portland, 500,000 people, use every year. This is just the deficit, okay? This isn't like the total amount of water. This is the deficit. And if you're familiar with an acre foot, typically an acre foot is described as, imagine a football field, which is about the size of an acre, a foot deep. That's 1 acre foot. So 110,000. So imagine a 110,000 foot tall tank the size of a football field. That's a big tank. I don't know how big is 110,000 feet, miles, right? 20 miles? It's mind-boggling. So this is a lovely work of abstract art, compliments of Google Earth of the Harney Basin. And you can see some dried crop circles here and the natural alkali desert. And there are some obvious roads and some ditches and streams and waterways and so forth. But it is, you know, I mean, if they were to pump the basin dry, you would end up with a moonscape, essentially. Irrigators and some codependent businesses rely on overpumping groundwater, but springs, streams, flora, fauna, domestic wells, groundwater-dependent ecosystems, which is what GDE stands for, and posterity, our future generations, are harmed or put at risk. This is what you're looking at, what we saw from overhead. The amount of water that is used is mind-boggling, and I'm going to show you a couple graphs in a second. Remember, 96% of all the water in the Harney Basin goes towards irrigation. And imagine if you're in a high desert, it's summertime, you know, there's a vapor pressure deficit, which is a very thirsty air. And the vapor pressure deficit is the difference between how thirsty the air is and the ground. And it's sucking the water off the leaves and it's sucking the water off the surface of the soil to like equate this and get the air to recalibrate its humidity levels. And, you know, this is, I charitably refer this as the Harney Basin groundwater pumping project. You know, essentially, we are going to, it's the groundwater evaporation project is what I call it. Yeah, they're basically going to evaporate the groundwater and get it into the jet stream and send it off. And because of climate change, we don't know really where that water is going beyond the Midwest and the Northeast and that kind of stuff, but it's not coming back like it used to. So this is compliments of the Water Resources Commission funded study called The Business Case for Investing in Water in Oregon. And on the left-hand side, you can see where the water comes in, the water sources. And on the right-hand side is where it goes out. So surface water accounts for 78% of all the water we use. Groundwater accounts for 22%. That's where the water's coming in. And this is the whole state of Oregon. Where is it going out? Well, in Oregon, which is not unusual, California and Nevada and other places, Arizona, agriculture water rights account for 78% of all the water that we divert every year. I mean, let's just think about this. I mean, they're talking about curtailing a third of the water use in the Harney Basin. That would be equivalent. The amount they're talking about curtailing is equivalent to 32 large data centers. Okay. So imagine like that's how much water they're just talking about curtailing, you know, to bring this basin back into stability over 30 years, mind you. If you see up here, domestic self-supply is only 1%. So there are 250,000 or 225,000 domestic wells at your house. We only use 1% of all the water. It's almost nothing. And then cities use public supply 9%. So Portland, Medford, Roseburg, Cave Junction, you know, Grants Pass, you know, all these cities across the state, 9%. Okay. And because the state of Oregon exports 80% of its agricultural products out of state and out of the nation, almost what? I mean, a huge portion of this water for irrigation is actually leaving the state. We are exporting our water hand and foot. So this is now, that was both surface water and groundwater. Now we're just going to look at groundwater. In the state of Oregon, with regard to groundwater, again, this is only 22% of the water that's used because surface water is the other 78%. But if we look at this, the blue is the type of wells and how many there are, and the red is the volume, okay? So under domestic here on the left, domestic wells account for 88% of all the wells, right? There's 225,000 domestic wells, but they only account for 4% of the groundwater. When we look at irrigation, irrigation wells only account for 7% of the wells, but they account for 82% of all the use. And then we go to the next one, community, which is the public self-supply. They account for 1% of the wells and 10% of the use. So when we're talking about like relative volumes of water here, you saw that gorgeous picture with, the green circles getting irrigated. People generally have no concept of just the extraordinary and vast amount of water use. And when we want to hate on data centers, really, it's not a winning argument when you complain about the water, because the amount of water data centers use, while it seems like a lot if you're like up in Portland and there's one next door and it's like it is next to you, it's nothing compared to irrigation. And one of the most fascinating, and I take my hat off to them, is that the irrigation industry has done such a fabulous job of hiding the fact of how much water they use. And these people are getting really upset about data centers. They just have no idea. It's just nothing compared to like the irrigation. Industrial irrigators seeking to maintain their water mining status quo to control their local destiny in the present comes at the expense of posterity and the ecosystem. So it's like, I've got mine, you get yours. It's the future, and the ecosystems are put at significant risk. I just love this picture. This is just another picture of the Harney Basin. And this is why I call it industrial. This is your community. This is what's going on in your community. And they've become so inured to it that they don't understand that they have been captured, that there are these, because it comes from within the community, they don't understand the impact. If it was like Exxon coming in from outside and coming at them, or big data centers want to come into the Harney Basin and take over and use the water, they'd be freaking out, right? And yet, because this is my cousin, this is my friend, this is my neighbor, this is me, my children, and we're all doing this, it's a massive industrial project, and it comes from within. And it's so unsustainable because every drop of this water that comes from groundwater has an impact on the groundwater reservoir. And I'll just say real quickly, there's top 100 feet of the groundwater reservoir, and that actually is the part that can experience recharge every year. That's the groundwater dependent ecosystems reach their roots into that. But below 100 feet or so, that's the ancient water. That's actually where almost all the big wells go, is below 100 feet. And they're pumping those confined groundwater reservoir areas dry, are down, dropping. I don't know if it's been dried out yet, but wells are drying out, of course. And so yes.
Is there a reason that they are growing alfalfa? Are there other crops that are less protected that they could be growing?
Yes, there are other crops. The question is why alfalfa and why not other less water intensive crops? It is purely financial.
Okay.
If you could grow sage or lavender, right?
Yeah.
Water, drought tolerant, right? But you don't make anywhere near as much money. The only reason, I come from the Illinois Valley. Why do they grow cannabis down there? Because it fetches $500 a pound or $1,000 a pound. I don't even know what it is these days, but it's like you can barely get people to grow a tomato for $4 a pound, but they will grow 24 plants in their backyard. And, or in some cases, organized crime syndicates grow 1,000 or 10,000. It's all just pure money. That's all it is. We are out here pumping groundwater and we are using alfalfa as this alchemical magic plant that transforms groundwater into money. And that is the sole equation. Every other
The growing of cattle.
so a lot of the alfalfa goes to cattle, but it also goes to horses and
Nowhere near the extent. We don't have that many horses in America.
well, but a lot of it's yes, but a lot of it is exported out of the country as well to China and Japan for their cattle.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, but I think you're right, mostly cattle, and so hamburgers and stuff like that are driving this desire.
Plus we have people from in Middle East who are buying land in Arizona and raising cattle and stuff to ship back to their country. And
Yeah.
so they have that too.
Very specifically, you're absolutely right. Countries from the Middle East decided in 2019, we're not going to pump our groundwater anymore. We're not stupid. And we'll just actually buy up farms in the desert of Arizona, which makes Harney County look like a rainforest. And buy up those lands and irrigate them with Colorado River water or groundwater, and then ship the hay and the alfalfa back overseas. That's exactly right.
Is this, that picture where it was all concentrated, is that primarily one or two farms, or is that a lot of small family farms, do you know?
I know on the right, that's mostly one or two. I don't know specifically, but this is around Highway 20, just at the bottom of these circles right up here. And that's that main road. And there may be 3 or 4 or 5 owners in here. I'm not really sure, but I know that there's at least one really big one for sure.
All that equipment's expensive to set up too.
Yes, it is. So what happens when a community is powerless over harming itself? When is state preemption necessary? And the answer is when local communities cannot avoid externalizing harms onto themselves and onto others. It's also when they're in denial. It's like, oh, this irrigation industry is great for us. We love it. We need to keep it going. They're in complete denial that they are actually harming themselves and the future generations. Therefore, state intervention, and I know this is a rough crowd here to be saying this, but state intervention by designating a critical groundwater area is necessary due to the pernicious effects of the tragedy of the commons. And it really comes down to the lack of self-control. A state assertion of trust duties, and if you're thinking of the public trust doctrine, a state assertion of trust duties to curb groundwater mining can be a legitimate, justice-oriented use of preemption authority, especially where illegitimate community rights claims are dominated by the very users causing basin-wide harm. I know it's a mouthful, but essentially, illegitimate community rights claims are basically saying like, hey, we live in this community and we need to be left alone by the state to continue the status quo of like extracting and mining all this water. And that's just not how community rights groups grow. So I just consider that illegitimate. In response to state preemption authority, large-scale industrial irrigators are effectively waging a community rights campaign, including pressing for voluntary agreements to reduce water use in lieu of state-imposed regulatory orders. And I put an asterisk there by effectively, because I don't think they actually named their efforts as community rights, and some may not even have any idea. But as you pointed out earlier, the timber companies in this region in Roseburg have been for years, decades. So I come late to this party. Thank you so much for letting me know that this concept is well precedented. Thank you. And we're going to get into voluntary agreements and what that means in just a second.
How much are the new wineries in the area affecting our waters?
So this is a good question. How much do wineries affect? I'm here to tell you wineries hardly use any water. So the French think that the Western California wine grape growers, Oregon, they think we're crazy that we irrigate our wine grapes. What are you, stupid? Right? To get the right sugar content is you got to basically like almost kill them as the fruit's coming on, just to make sure. And that's like, I'm not a vintner, so I don't really understand how this works. I just know that a friend of mine who is the manager for a vineyard down in the Illinois Valley, he's like, yeah, the guy's like always like running the vines on the edge of destruction, but he's getting that sugar, right? Also, the newer vines that are in the earlier years are sending out their roots, and you want your roots to not establish shallow, but you want them to establish deep, and so it's more sustainable. So what'll happen is you'll hear propaganda about like vineyards using lots of water. Well, during the winter, you'll see that they have these big sprinklers, and that's freeze protection. So when their vines are going to freeze, they'll turn on sprinklers, right? Well, the rivers are at flood stage.
Yeah.
Who cares, right?
They do that in Florida.
Sure thing, right? So but the fact is, wineries really just don't use that much water. And with cannabis, for instance, I did a big report on cannabis water use in the Illinois Valley. They took like a 500 million gallon drink in 2021. 82% of the grows were unlicensed. There was a lot of water theft and misappropriation of water, but 500 million gallons really isn't that much. But the water use punches above its weight class, and it inspires human rights violations, solid waste, fecal and chemical waste, and clearing riparian areas and forested areas, and mayhem on the backcountry roads, and stressed out killed wildlife, and so on. So water use isn't necessarily a one-to-one ratio with like gallons of rate and duty with like harm. It is with alfalfa. It's pretty straightforward. It is in this case. It's a different situation.
It's not the marijuana industry, I just put my 2 cents. Grapes can also be grown on rocky land. You don't need this till that's coming off of the river where they now have appropriated what should be used for row crops or food into grapes here.
The grapes can do really well, and you might even sell your bottles of wine for more if you're growing them on a rocky outcrop because you get, exactly.
Lots of rock.
Sure.
Yes, my biggest problem with them is I'm a water monitor, and they just put so much dirt and so much chemicals into our rivers. I mean, it was terrible when they were all coming from California, because California had such a glut in wine that was Californians coming up here, and the rivers, Cow Creek was a big good example. They just almost stopped it flowing from getting everything plowed up and just letting it all go to the river. And then they use all their chemicals, and those that aren't organic, and which is probably most of them, there come all the chemicals down, and we tested all those waters. I know for what I talk.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to reach out to the Oregon Department of Agriculture and the Department of Environmental Quality. And let me guess, do you get responses that are sufficient and satisfy you?
What do you think?
So it's really funny because I've recently mentioned how the Illinois Valley folks don't feel like the Water Resources Department is responsive to them when they call the water master and say, my neighbor down the street, whatever, and they throw a trash pump into the river. They're pumping 6 to 8 hours a day, 80 gallons a minute, or whatever it is they're pumping. And they're sucking up huge amounts of water. They're sucking up salmon fry, whatever it is that's grinding up in those pumps. And they're irrigating unlicensed cannabis. And for years, I've heard people complain that either they don't get a response to their complaints, or, and worse, they get acknowledged and then nothing happens. And so are you suggesting that that's the same experience you get too?
They're pretty much all here now. I guess I feel a lot better that they don't use all that much water, because
sure.
But whatever, they're using more water than what was there. The oak trees. They took down oak savanna after oak savanna.
Yeah.
And it just destroyed the oak in a lot of areas.
Well, so we're going to move on. Let's see here. We left off with the large scale, and when I say large scale industrial, we are not talking about like our little backyard gardeners or our farmers market gardeners, or even like most farms that you see. I'll just stop here for a commercial break and mention that 5% of Oregon farms account for 80% of the economic impact of the industry. So 5%, we're talking about consolidation, remember, big ag farms. 5% account for 80%. That means 95% of the farms we see account for 20%. 95% of the farms account for 20% of the economic activity. And so most of my critiques about irrigation are to that 5%. I mean, I grew up on a farm in Vermont. I started the Cape Junction Farmers Market with some other folks. I homesteaded for many years. I got a water right. I've irrigated with water on a small, little, homestead in the Illinois Valley. I believe strongly in family farms. They're the backbone of our society. Those are not what I'm talking about here. Mm-hmm. Basically 95% of the farms out there really are of almost no concern in terms of their water use or the impacts they have compared to some of the tiniest, largest, biggest ones. Mm-hmm. I just want to make sure that that is well understood. In the Harney Basin, irrigators are pressing hard to implement what are called voluntary agreements. And it's a statute under ORS 537.745, and it is to assert local control over their extractive water mining. So in fact, the state, if you can believe this, the state, which retains 100% of preemptive authority, actually created a statute that allows irrigators to, and we're not talking all irrigators, we're just talking groundwater irrigators. So there's this section of the water code that deals just with groundwater, and the voluntary agreements allow irrigators, if they put together a voluntary agreement and it gets approved by the Water Resource Commission, to actually be sheltered from the entire set of these groundwater laws. It's an amazing shelter.
They self-report.
Well, I mean, in fact, actually, what's interesting is that there is some proposed guidance on voluntary agreements that the state has produced recently, and it went from we're going to check you monthly and yearly for all your water use to self-reporting to actually not even bothering. So that's a comment that's going to be put in the next hopper. But voluntary agreements, if approved by the Water Resource Commission, so they do actually have to get approved, and the Water Resource Commission can look at a voluntary agreement and be like, yeah, no. They control in lieu of state regulatory orders related to groundwater use. And the entire water code, mind you, reserves the state's preemptive authority to manage water, except for here. Now, that is, again, just more corporate state preemptive authority. That's still just, and it happened in 1955. And we'll talk about that. In 1955, powerful water user interests pressed for the voluntary agreement statute to establish self-control alternatives to the regulatory water use curtailments that the state would propose under critical groundwater area statutes. And so that's a mouthful, I'll explain it. Harney Basin, excessively declining groundwater levels, it's a critical groundwater area. It's critically a problem. In order to designate a critical groundwater area, you got to start a rulemaking process. So you get your rulemaking process going. Then the Water Resource Commission would adopt those rules. The designation has occurred. Now it's a critical groundwater area. Now you can actually impose corrective control orders, and you can reduce water use. You can impose water use curtailments. And what the voluntary agreements do is it says, oh, I want to filter from all of that. So what we'll do is we'll create a voluntary agreement, like a compact that gets recognized by the state, kind of like place-based planning gets recognized. And we will function within this compact to reduce our water use, but we'll do it. We got this. We really, and again, think about this. This is the tragedy of the commons. Enacting voluntary agreements in the tragedy of the commons is incomprehensible given the inability for water miners to exhibit self-control regarding their water use. We're to believe that if, you guys put together this voluntary agreement, that you will abide by your neighbors over here who aren't in them. So here's like here are your neighbors, they're getting regulated off. They're not in a voluntary agreement. And here you are in a voluntary agreement. And now you're going to like, do the right thing. And the state has ways of like enforcing this. They can actually shut down the voluntary agreement. Okay. But really, and because of that, these things actually function more as stalling tactics. And there's this whole like paper coming out of California, like Stanford and Berkeley, that talks about how voluntary agreements in California, really, they're just big stalling tactics. That's what they are.
The answer for that is to get them out of state.
Yes,
Wait, no, no voluntary agreements. It
yes.
shouldn't be
And,
voluntary.
and think about this, where else are there voluntary agreements in our state code?
Right.
But self-control to manage water use fails because they lack the self-control to reduce water use. Let me say that again. Self-control to manage their own water use in a tragedy of commons fails because they lack the self-control to reduce it. I mean, it's like these voluntary agreements have been on the books since 1955. Mind you, never once in the last 70 years have they ever been enacted. They're just never, no one's ever been able to figure out how to make them work. And so now the state is threatening regulatory action and they're like, oh, let us like try to sort this out. And we're asking these folks who would rather like mine all the water to further, manage themselves. It's just, and in all aspects, powerful lobbies control the state to impose limits on communities. I'll say that again. In all aspects of the law in the state of Oregon, powerful lobbies control the state to impose limits on communities. That is why community rights activists exist. But where else do they lobby for communities to reserve self-control or power? Where do these powerful lobbies throughout the rest of our laws actually say, oh, no, we need to make sure that the communities can like have control?
Yeah.
It's obscene, right?
As if the communities actually have.
Yeah.
As if the communities actually have control, right? Well, when a large industry, here's the answer, when a large industry manifests as a community of land and water users, as is in this case, then that community is the industry. And they were very prescient. 70 years ago, they're like, oh, you're going to pass these critical groundwater area statutes. Well, let's like pass these voluntary agreement statutes at the same time so that our industry, which is decentralized, across basins, on farms, when you go to regulate these, the state, well, we'll have an out. Ironically, voluntary agreements are the very corporate state preemption that we had discussed earlier. Voluntary agreements are the very same species of corporate industry control over a community to extract its resources. It just comes from within. It's fascinating.
And where else?
But community rights, as we all know, are not typically used to assert the right to mine the commons. They are to protect the commons. That's how we know this is, preposterous. This is a problem because severely impairing natural resources from within a community harms posterity, which is our future generations, and the rights of those to enjoy water in the same way that we do today. So you're going to muck around here and overpump the groundwater. The future is going to be preempted. And what I use is, if you're familiar with the doctrine of prior appropriation, where there's seniority in water rights and junior water rights, first in time, first in right, meaning that if you got an older water right, you don't get shut off. I argue that because of the doctrine of prior appropriation, the present has seniority over the future, and we are regulating the future off as if it were a junior water user. That is what's going on. And I also argue that the doctrine of prior appropriation is a descendant from the doctrine of discovery. If you're familiar with the doctrine of discovery, which is actually codified in the US law, is that if you find a $20 bill on the ground, you can pick it up type of thing. Well, if I'm coming across Horace Greeley says, go west, young man. So they go west, manifest destiny. We get out here and all along the way, we see things and we just take them. Right? That's the doctrine of discovery. Take the land, take the water, extirpate the Native Americans and the beavers and everything else you can find, trample all the sagebrush and whatever else. And then coming out of the doctrine of discovery, which is if you see it, you can take it, is the same thing with the water. Oh, there's a river. I tack on a tree, my name, I got here first. I'm the first one to this river. I have seniority. And so it draws on this concept of like firstborn son, monarchy, first in line. I mean, it's just like second graders fighting to get in line to go to the cafeteria. It's just a horrible way to manage your water use, and especially in the 21st century,
Yeah.
when we're overpumping all the water supplies and we're experiencing now water scarcity. So,
Which is why community rights groups are trying to give rights to things like waterways and watersheds.
absolutely.
Because then you can't tap your thing, say you own it. No, it has its own rights.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This problem of community rights, they're not usually used to mine the commons. And it's a problem because severely impairing natural resources from within a community harms posterity and the rights to use the rights of those to enjoy water in the same way that we do today. I'm going to get into that right now. Oregon law declares that all the water in the state belongs to the public. That is a law. And it's like that in most Western states. While water use must obviously be beneficial to the user, like here I am with my water right pumping the river or the groundwater, it must also be in the greater public interest. At the very least, water use cannot be a detriment and a harm to the public health, safety, and welfare. A very good example. Water Resource Department said, Chris, you know the water that the organized crime syndicates are using to irrigate unlicensed cannabis. Yeah, we hear you, it's causing problems, but if they have a water right, it's not against the law. And I'm like, hold on a second, you're saying that they can use water in the commission of a crime and they can actually use water rights? Well, that didn't last long. So the legislature came to the rescue and they passed Senate Bill 326, which says, if you are growing unlicensed cannabis, you may not use a water right to irrigate that crime, because why would we be doing this when the sheriff's coming in? You know, it's like, absolutely not, right? Well, what happened is that the state recognized that the public interest, and all of us out here were like, we don't think that's a very good use of water.
Oh.
No, this guy from Serbia or Croatia or Bulgaria or the bro from like Humboldt County that moved in to the Illinois Valley, they may think that their water right is, or their water use, whether they have a water right or not, is great. They will like their own water use because they're making money from it. So there's a difference between the beneficial use and the reasonable use that the user uses and then how the public feels about it. And remember, the water belongs to the public, so they have a say. And so that's an important factor here. So while water use must obviously be beneficial to the user, it must also be in the greater public interest. At the very least, water use cannot be a detriment and a harm to the public health, safety, and welfare. So maybe somebody's using water over here and it only benefits them, but it's not harming anybody else. Well, then who cares, right? That's fine, right? Large-scale water users may not preempt the rights of our descendants to enjoy water as we do. The interests of future generations impose real obligations on today's society not to exhaust or pollute water sources that must remain intact for posterity's equal and undiminished enjoyment. This goes back hundreds of years. This is not new. Immanuel Kant was talking about how it's okay to like use something as long as you leave enough for somebody else. And so if the president is going to use water, okay, we don't have a right, however, to use it at someone else's expense. Rather than granting absolute dominion over resources, usufructuary rights impose duties of care and restraint and preservation, especially when dealing with finite or slowly renewing natural systems such as ancient groundwater reservoirs. And I'll remind us that usufructuary rights are the right to the reasonable use of water, not a possessory ownership. So when we talk about how all the water in the state belongs to the public, well, the reason why one person like me, Chris, can't own the water is because it belongs to everyone. right? So a usufructuary right is the right to go to the apple tree and to use the tree and pick an apple and have the reasonable use. It doesn't mean pick all the apples for myself. It means to like be able to get one or two or have my share and leave enough for everybody else to have some too. And but we all share in ownership of the tree, but we don't own the tree. No one person owns the tree. And the term fruct, as in fructose corn syrup, fruct, that means fruit. And so this is a Latin term, usu, fruct, use of the fruit. And so we get to use the fruit of the tree, but we don't get to own the tree. And so we get a reasonable use, not an unlimited use, and not a possessory either.
We don't get to use the tree, pick all the apples and sell them to our neighbors.
Which, thank
What
you.
happens with Roseburg Forest Products.
Yes.
Right? In
Yes.
Northern California.
So the comment is that it's not right for some one person to go to the tree, pick all the apples, and then take them for themselves and then sell them to the people that could have just picked them themselves. And that's what they're doing with our natural resources, our public lands and that sort of thing.
That's what you said.
And I'm repeating it for the camera. The public and their elected and appointed officials have a responsibility to hold water in trust, to ensure the sanctity of water for posterity, which includes the ecosystem that all life relies upon for survival. So we have asked, what happens when the harm comes from within a community? Like, what are we going to do about this? And so community rights activists stand with posterity and ecosystems, not against them. I know this to be true. I've never met a community activist who would debate that question. As we care for our future selves, we must recognize water as a fundamental element of life and integrate this indigenous wisdom into our state and community policies and practices.
Isn't that kind of why we exist? Because we're fighting for those rights?
That's right. So there is pro-posterity and pro-environmental community rights strategies, embracing future obligations and protecting ecosystems, whereas on the other hand, are industry-led so-called community rights that are an inversion of the process, and they use the terms collaboration, and they use the terms consensus to corrode regulation and externalize costs. I went to a Quaker college. I know all about consensus. And I recently wrote a very large paper on how consensus is actually not as great as it sounds, because as I mentioned earlier, we all consented on overpumping oil and gas, and now we've got climate change. We've all consented, that electricity is great and power is great. We've all consented that, too many of us, and many of us didn't even know that we consented to the overpumping of all this water. And, consensus has caused all sorts of problems throughout all of history. Yes.
Do you consider consensus as buying something that, like a papa, that in our purchasing power, that is a way of consenting to something?
Absolutely. So we have all consented that this consumer society is just fabulous. I can go to Walmart, I can go to McDonald's, I can go to Amazon, I can get everything that I need. And I'm here speaking to you with a ball cap on and with a web camera and an Apple computer and some fancy digital equipment and a lovely library built out of wood. We are all part of the system. And in fact, the truth is that getting out of consenting is almost impossible. We were born into the system, but it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it. A lot of times someone will use a fallacy and say, well, Chris, you eat food, you drive a car, you have a computer, you use lithium. And I don't agree that I can't critique the system. I have almost no chance of escaping.
Yeah.
And if it was
how the system works.
correct.
How does the system function?
Yes. It's a common fallacy that because somebody is trapped within an existing society or system, that you don't have a right to critique it. It's just not true.
We get what we want, not what we need. I mean, we go by what we want, not really considering too much what we need.
Mm-hmm. And that's an issue. So we are here at the question and answer, and I've been delighted to be able to like talk along the way. It's been fabulous. And really this is an opportunity to wrap up this part of the conversation, but to explore more deeply. And so I just had this like, a good presentation or a good exploration or a good path that you follow will come up with future questions. They always say philosophy doesn't really provide so much as answers as it does more questions. And here I have a question is, what if the state enacted laws that empowered communities, but instead of voluntary actions being reserved for extractive industries, they served posterity and the environment? So here we are in Roseburg, and there are voluntary agreements, as it were, that are in statute that the state says, hey, you can put together a proposal to like govern yourselves or to control a certain aspect of your life. It's like pumping irrigation or whatever it is, right? And we would like to govern how trees are cut down in the Roseburg region or the Douglas County region. And so we would like to have that freedom of action, right? What would it take for the state to agree to that? I mean, if they agreed to the voluntary agreements for irrigators, well, how about other ones?
Well, this past March, we had record flooding, and there was an area of the Callahan Mountain area that owners had said to the logging industry, you shouldn't cut here. We've had experts come in, give testimony that this land is unstable, that it's ripe for major landslides, and that's what happened.
Mhm.
Luckily, nobody died, but it was a miracle that nobody died. So, I mean, maybe it's going to take people dying for the state to step up and say, no more of this reckless clear cutting.
Mhm.
And that's just an example. I mean, do people have to die before the state comes in? Because our county commissioners sure as hell don't give a damn. People went to them with information and said, look, this is a ticking time bomb. If you clear cut these areas, boom, they just approved it. And what everyone said would happen, happened.
That was county land, by the way, that's why she mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. So the
Yeah.
county sold off
Yeah.
or
And it
had a
was
portion of it.
Park, and it was used for educational purposes, and they just had all these hardwood trees, these beautiful hardwood trees that they poisoned to kill them in order to better harvest the Douglas fir. So I don't know what it will take for the state to step in, because it was a miracle no one was killed.
It
Mhm.
might be a way for the community to step in. Actually, a couple of years ago, we started a group here that was looking at a proposal for community forests and looking at the options of creating special districts in Oregon for actually that control. Similar to the forest where you're more close to your neck of the woods, right, in Ashland, where there's a park that's taken over in the Ashland area, a city, right? That concept of, then the community is then managing it under a government structure, because I'm not a big fan of just letting all communities decide shit, okay? Because I live in Douglas County.
Yeah.
And the reality is, I do believe in preemption. I even believe in federal preemption in certain things. I do, because I think they're a necessary evil, if you will, just because of the tragedy of the commons and the greed in humans. Right? So, but that whole idea, we kind of set it to the side, but you were involved in it because Richard was drawing that whole proposal, but we started that discussion after Chuck Willer had come here, and talked about the extraction industry, the Wall Street, forestry, which is all interrelated to it. But there is a possibility the state could, we have special districts, as you mentioned, them to illustrate how the structure of government. There's nothing in the special district laws right now that allow a community forest, but they could be, right? There could be a special district, and people in a community area could say, we want to manage the forest, public forest land that's in this area. I mean, it's theoretically possible, and probably maybe easier than getting the state to actually go after these laws when they have this powerful industry lobbying all of our state agencies.
And there's a direct connection between the logging industry and water quality.
Of course, and I wanted to mention Lauren Reagan, who founded the Civil Liberties Defense Center. A few years ago, I asked her to be a keynote speaker or something. And so she asked, and it's a law center. Are you familiar with civil? Yeah, I assume so.
Yes.
You know, and they do a lot of environmental, immigration, a lot of different stuff. And so I said, she asked us what we want to speak. I said, I want you to tell me what you think is the most important. And she said, water. And I said, really? And she goes, absolutely. It is the most important thing that we need to be fighting for right now. And, you know, and she's right. I mean, that's really, I think that, and that's really what attracted me. I think I saw you on something online that you did, maybe for the state thing. And, you know, and what you're trying to sell, which I think is good. There's nothing wrong with selling stuff.
Well, I'm not selling anything.
No,
I'm not a nonprofit organization.
Guys don't put up all the
Philosophy, we're engaging the public in water stewardship. Yeah.
But I think it's great that what I think that people need to know, need to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Did something happen a year or two ago with water rights in southern and southeastern Oregon? Because this may have been more than 2 years ago, but I remember kind of seeing a brouhaha about something between the county and the state in terms of there were farmers saying, turn our water back on. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
There was something that happened and farmers and ranchers in that area were livid, and they were so angry at the governor. Then they basically were like, turn our water back on.
It sounds to me like you might be talking about Klamath County.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So in various years, the most memorable moment in history was about 25 years ago. I get the dates exactly a little bit off, but the Bureau of Reclamation, which, you know, manages a lot of the water out in that region, has a responsibility to manage water for a number of uses, and irrigation is not just the only one.
Right.
And there are the Klamath tribes
Right.
that have the oldest water rights.
Yep.
And their water rights are non-consumptive. They are in-stream water rights for their traditional first foods and for their way of life, which includes making sure there's enough water for the chwam and cockatoo and other fish to survive. And the irrigators who have junior rights were just livid.
Yes, they were.
And what's amazing is that it's like, hello, well, you've been like heralding prior appropriation forever, and now when it doesn't work for you,
Yeah.
you know? And of course, that reminds me of just how absurd prior appropriation is, which says first in time, first in right. And here are these settlers that come out in
Yeah.
the 1850s and 60s and 70s and 80s, you know, 100 and some odd years ago, and extirpate the indigenous people and all the flora and fauna that get in the way.
Yeah.
And then just take everything. And then that's like year zero.
Yeah.
As if like 18,000 years before, where they have evidence of like human activity in the Paisley Caves in Riley, Oregon, mind you, which is in the Harney Basin, 18,000 years ago, living there. And to say that they don't actually, you know, I mean, and of course we know, however, that in this 21st century, that time immemorial rights to water are being recognized for indigenous communities. And yeah, and it's just driving the irrigators crazy.
People used to come up here years ago just to buy a house that had water. Old grandfather did water on the contract. So even new people from California come up here and buy water rights automatically, typically grandfathered into the property.
Yes.
You're
So,
right. Those people were infuriated that the actual first peoples
right.
had first rights
Mhm.
to water, and they weren't even doing harm. They were using the water for their historical purposes. These weren't extractors.
Right.
They weren't mining water. But I just remember it being a firestorm of people, give us back our water. Your water? That's an interesting way to put it, but that's how they put
Right.
it.
Yeah. And in fact, the water belongs to the public
Yeah,
and you have a right to the reasonable use within
yeah,
the limits of your water rights certificate or decree as it may be. And yet, if you don't have seniority in this system that you created,
yeah,
then, you're just not going to get it. And so, this idea that, heads I win, tails you lose type of thing.
yeah.
It's the moral sanctimony that comes out of so much exceptionalism.
Yeah.
All of a sudden goes out the window when it's not working. And so it's a matter of.
Doctrine did not apply to Native Americans.
No, it didn't. It applied to.
That's what this is all part of that.
That's correct. Really, it's just been a very short 150 years since we were actively applying the doctrine of discovery. And in, the amount of time that humans have been around, it's a blip in time. And so we really haven't moved past any of that stuff deep within. It's the inherent, assumptions. I mean, again, people walk down the street, they see $20 and they think, well, that's mine.
Which is why I appreciated at the beginning that you acknowledged, that we are on indigenous people's lands. And I mean, I think those things are important.
Mhm.
Some people may mock us and laugh at us for that. And it's like, you're an immigrant. I don't care when your family came here. You're not a native.
No, not one bit. No. And I am honored to be here, and I consider myself lucky and deeply appreciative. And I'm going to do what I can to give back in that vein, and to ensure that what I can do is not continue to perpetuate some of the worst atrocities and acts that have been done that in fact actually made it possible for me to have a fairly successful life in society.
Yeah, we need to help our native communities.
And everyone, everybody, our native communities, ourselves, our communities down the street, whatever we can do to support each other. And when
water.
Yes, water. And again, I like to think of, we're 70% water, right?
Yeah.
I mean, my body is the closest to water I will ever get, in fact. And so how I treat water is how I treat myself.
Yeah.
And it's how I treat you and others. And how we treat the world around us. And if we acknowledge that we are water, that without water, I'm like a piece of beef jerky, essentially. Water animates me and it animates trees and it animates all the relatives and everybody. And without it, there is no life. And so I have tried to move away from the term water use. I refer to it in talks and conversations when discussing the system that I'm in, but I try to move towards enjoyment. So I'd rather like to enjoy water today and hope that the way I enjoy water today does not preempt others in the future from enjoying the same. And when we use the word use, we think of extraction and exploitation. We're going to exploit the resource. And if I'm water and if you're water, I don't use people. That's sociopathic, So this idea that we use water and that we extract it and exploit it is we thingify it. The term is rightfying. And this idea that we can other water is really the precondition for them to take advantage of it and to treat it poorly and to degrade its quality and so forth. And so if I realize that I'm water and I want to learn to treat myself with respect and learn to love myself, then I also will then carry that forward with wherever water is. And essentially, I think of myself and others as we're all very discrete hydrologic units of the watershed. And we're, as I learned from indigenous people, we are all just more of the river flowing. And as I move through life and as I travel through town and as I walk about and drive about and move about, I am just more of the river flowing. And the water that's in me could have come from my ancestors. It could have been in dinosaurs. Who knows? But I think of like in a rather poetic way that, water falls in little drops, and each little drop is one of us. And we fill a little ditch and a little puddle, and then we form a creek and a stream and a river, and then we flow out into an ocean that is all of us. And we float back up and we fall back down again. And throughout all of history, this cycle of like life is who we are. It's not even really a metaphor. It's literal.
Yeah.
And if we can embrace that understanding, those are what are called biospheric values, where I don't other nature. I actually see myself as part of nature. Again, I am the closest to nature that I will ever get. And if I can actually not other nature, then maybe I won't be trashing it as much. And I won't think of like using it like a water bank. And I won't just think of it as that I came out, and moved out west. And I did. I moved out west from Vermont on a farm in Vermont. And just take what I can get, right? And if I don't take it, then Billy or Sally will take it. So I might as well get what I can, which again is the tragedy of the commons. And that tragedy plays out in so many aspects of our lives. And I think that we are to,
Speculating.
Yep.
Everything.
If we are to work and care for the future, we should have the beneficial use of water for posterity.
Do you have any suggestions about how we can get voluntary agreements?
So they're in statute. And so what it would require is a large enough number of legislators, and probably the governor's support as well, even though the legislature controls what the laws are, to get them to repeal it. And right now, after 70 years, for the very first time, a group of irrigators in the Harney Basin who are backed into the corner with, regulatory water use curtailments on the horizon are now trying to implement these very difficult to implement voluntary agreements. The Oregon Water Resources Department has created what are they calling proposed guidance on voluntary agreements. So if you're going to put together a voluntary agreement here are the guidelines you're going to need to follow. And the guidelines are clearly been tinkered with by those who have an interest in trying to make them work. But they have also been very carefully written and worded in a way that I strongly support, that protects the sanctity of the rules and the regulations that the state has to ensure that groundwater declines are stopped in this region where they're just going down too fast. So I have a number of comments that I'm going to be submitting related to the proposed guidelines on voluntary agreements in the Harney Basin. However, the short answer is they'd have to get repealed in the legislature, and it would take, you would have the biggest, next to the timber industry, the biggest lobby to push against, who has still a substantial regulatory capture mechanism in place.
I'm gonna have to go soon, but I want to thank you. It's been really good. I know I've come from the Northwest or Northeast also, and we had the No Way Perrier, where the, big water companies were buying us springs and pumping them dry and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the orange growers. I have friends down in Florida where I'm from that, their wells go dry because the thousands of acres of orange groves are pumping the things dry. Not to mention, the pollution from all the chemicals that goes down into the groundwater.
It's making a stew. And as they pump that water out, the salt water is infiltrating in various regions at different rates and different times. But, and Florida's got 2 feet above sea level. It's So the chemical leaching coming from all the orange groves using pesticides, herbicides, and whatever else, fertilizers, and then pumping the fresh water and the salt water infiltrating, it's just a matter of time before they've got this like stew of like brackish water that's not irrigable. Yeah.
And then people will have to spend more and more money to filter to even be able to drink in your home.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
I'm wondering if are there any federal laws or does the federal ever come in and say, look, through the state, you're not doing it right, or I mean, are there federal laws that have been there all the time and the states have been given the rights to it looks like the states have the right to to over what happens to the water in the state. So anyway, I'm just wondering how much federal might have to do with something if something gets really bad in say, because there were farmers in California that they were raising hell because they closed the lake there on the east. I can't think of the name of the lake. I don't think it's Klamath. What's the lake east?
Because of the dam.
The big lake.
Klamath?
No, nothing to do with that dam.
The Klamath Lake.
No, there's a town over there. I don't know. It's Eastern Oregon. Anyhow, there was a problem and they actually closed the lake down from the California farmers doing irrigation. And I mean, I come from a hay hauling California people, and that's where we got all of our hay to. But anyhow, actually I'm from an Iowa farm first, so been everywhere. But anyway, I guess I'm wondering, are there federal laws that kind of overlook everything, and then the state's laws have to agree to those federal laws? And if there are, does the feds ever come in and say, look, you're not handling this right, we've got to do something?
So in the United States, the federal government, and the question is, what role does the federal government play?
If any.
So the federal government plays a big role in water quality. So we know the Clean Water Act, and water quality has to do with whether or not water is getting impaired, as the quality is going down. And the Clean Water Act is a big sprawling document that works to ensure that the water that's in the United States and all the 50 states isn't completely destroyed. Really, the way the Clean Water Act works is that it sets limits and you're not allowed to go past this limit. So you can destroy things up to this limit. And we'll give you a permit. So like, here's fresh, clean water, but I want to put in a big industry. And so the Clean Water Act is going to say, well, you can destroy the river up to this point, and we will permit you with your permit to put this much crap in the river. And that's what your permit is for, is to dump that much crap in the river. And so that's kind of like the state, the government. And then what happens is that the state environmental quality agencies, like in Oregon, it's called the Department of Environmental Quality. They conform with federal standards on many levels. And then the state also sets its own standards as well.
Okay.
When it comes to water use, which is different from water quality, that is almost exclusively a state-controlled activity. And so the state, when it was formed in 1859, for the most part, the federal government relinquished most of its rights to any water as the time the state was formed. And now Oregon, just like any other state, gets to control how water use occurs. We use water rights. We follow various doctrines and so forth. There are still some aspects of the way the federal government controls water. So the Army Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation manage water storage and other big infrastructure water projects that the federal government has the money and the resources to put in. You think these dams are expensive. And usually, though not all the way, but usually the Army Corps of Engineers deals with, dams for levies for municipal water uses. And then the Bureau of Reclamation does it more for like irrigation. So it's not perfectly clean. And it's only for like big certain projects, right? So their Bureau of Rec is involved in the Klamath area. You know, the Army Corps of Engineers runs a few dams in the Roseburg Basin. You know, for impounding water for like the Medford Water Commission. And then there's this other area, which is a doctrine that you're familiar with called the public trust doctrine. And that goes back to Justinian times in Rome about 2,000 years ago, which basically said that nobody gets to like fish out all the fish or block someone from fishing. Nobody gets to block navigation going up and down rivers. And the public trust doctrine protects navigable waterways from private encroachment. And that includes the coastal shores. That includes big rivers that are navigable. And over time, the way that's evolved, especially in Hawaii and California, is that, well, here's a stream or a creek. It fills a lake like Lake Mono, and that lake is being drained, or those tributaries are being drained to go send water to LA. And the public trust doctrine was used and said, well, Lake Mono is a navigable lake. These streams are what fill it. If you drain the streams, then there's no lake. Therefore, you can't drain the streams. They made a hydrologic connection, even though those creeks were not navigable. And then in California, the Scott River decision about 7, 8 years ago said that groundwater, as we all know, infiltrates and discharges to streams and creeks across the basin. And those streams and creeks all flow down into the Scott River. Scott River is navigable. And the state, through the public trust doctrine, acknowledged that the groundwater is hydraulically connected to the surface water. Therefore, you may not overpump the groundwater. And then what happens is someone throws a fit and it works its way through and it works its way through the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen often, but it has happened. There's a famous case in Chicago where a railroad was given, a huge portion of the Lake Michigan waterfront back in the 1800s. And they just blocked the whole Lake City from the waterfront area. And we're going to put in the, train station or whatever it is. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was like, yeah, no, you legislature, you cannot do this. This is the public trust holding. The public has a right to access those shores, and you may not just give it away to some like corporation. And that is actually a way the federal government has set a major precedent for all other states to follow in terms of how and what to expect with regard to the public trust doctrine. And yet states individually apply this doctrine differently. And I'll have you know that Oregon is one of the most regressive states. We have California to our south, which is one of the most progressive states with regard to the public trust doctrine. And there hasn't been any case in recent memory that would move the needle on the public trust doctrine. And so that has passed. There have been cases that have been rejected by the Oregon Supreme Court. But yeah, it's Cherniak versus Brown is one of them. But the time is ripe for a challenge in the courts on the public trust doctrine regarding water in Oregon, and it's brewing.
Would that be somebody who wants to use a waterway in Harney County, and the waterways are diminishing because of the water extraction? Like, would that be efficient?
That's a very interesting question. So the Harney Basin is what's very interesting. The Harney Basin is what's called a closed basin. It's just a big bathtub. It actually doesn't flow out to the ocean. When, all the water falls in, and then eventually it goes out. It travels in and out throughout the basin because the whole basin is one big reservoir, one big tub. But applying the public trust doctrine in the Harney Basin would require a slightly different tact, which is essentially saying that the state of Oregon must hold water in trust regardless of whether or not it's navigable. And if you don't sufficiently hold water in trust, you're not you're not discharging your fiduciary duty to protect this resource for the public to which it belongs, because all the water belongs to the public.
Yeah.
There are people in posterity and in the future. There are ecosystems that we rely upon, and you're just allowing these like big industrial interests to destroy it. And that would be a somewhat like I wouldn't call it radical, but it would be a far stretch to push the public trust doctrine that way in a closed basin. But in basins where there are navigable rivers, such as this basin going out to the ocean, somebody's destroying groundwater and surface water that supports this navigable river. That's a much cleaner. So yes, the Winchester Dam is a severe impediment to the anadromous fish that need to get up above that dam. And it's basically like a playground for a couple dozen houses,
Right.
essentially.
But has that been challenged? I mean, I know there's lawsuits.
Yeah, no, it hasn't.
They haven't used the public trust.
No, and I think the folks who are working on that, Water Watch, would be knocking on that door if they thought they could. But I would leave it to them to answer that question for sure.
Well, we got some people here who are very involved in Winchester.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. It's been a real
Do
pleasure.
you have a card or anything?
Sure do.